November 14, 2004. Mid-morning, off the coast of Southern California, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group is conducting routine training exercises in the warning areas roughly 100 miles southwest of San Diego. The sky is clear, visibility is good. The sea is calm. There is nothing about this morning that would lead any of the personnel across the strike group to expect that what is about to happen will still be discussed in congressional hearings, in intelligence briefings, on front pages, nearly 2 decades later. It helps to understand what a carrier strike group actually is, because it frames why this encounter carries the weight it does. A strike group is not a single ship. It is a coordinated formation built around a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, surrounded by guided missile cruisers and destroyers, with its own air wing, its own layered radar coverage, and thousands of trained personnel whose entire profession is situational awareness over a vast stretch of ocean and sky. It is, in effect, one of the most sensor-saturated environments humans ever create. A moving bubble of overlapping radar, sonar, and visual observation designed specifically to ensure that nothing approaches undetected. This is the setting in which the events of mid-November 2004 unfolded. Whatever the objects were, they were not glimpsed by one tired observer at the edge of perception. They appeared inside one of the most thoroughly monitored pieces of airspace on the planet, and they were logged by the very systems built to make sure nothing goes unaccounted for. Commander David Fravor is the commanding officer of the F/A-18F Squadron aboard the Nimitz. He is a graduate of the Navy's Top Gun School, with 18 years of military aviation experience and thousands of flight hours. He is, by every professional measure, a reliable, trained, precise observer in the air. Flying alongside him is Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, with a weapons systems officer in the back seat of each jet, 4 trained aircrew in 2 aircraft. The USS Princeton, the strike group's guided missile cruiser, equipped with the AN/SPY-1 radar, one of the most capable air defense radar systems in the surface fleet, has been tracking something, not just today, for about 2 weeks. Since around November 10th, the Princeton's radar operators, including operations specialist Kevin Day, had been logging contacts appearing at very high altitude. Figures around 80,000 feet are cited in the accounts, then descending rapidly toward the ocean, and, in some cases, holding at lower altitude before vanishing from the scope. The AN/SPY-1 deserves a word because it bears directly on how seriously to take the radar tracks. It is not a simple search radar. It is a phased array system, the centerpiece of the Aegis combat system, designed to track many targets at once with high precision, built specifically to manage the air defense picture for a carrier strike group in a combat environment. It is the kind of system whose entire purpose is to not be fooled, because being fooled in combat means missiles get through. When operators on a system like that log a contact, check it, run diagnostics, and continue to see it, the prior probability that it is simply a glitch drops considerably. That does not make the contacts exotic. It does mean they cannot be casually dismissed as a radar hiccup. The behavior did not match the known flight pattern of any aircraft, drone, or balloon in the operator's experience. The descents, by the radar accounts, were extraordinarily fast. At first, the operators suspected a radar malfunction. The system was checked, run through diagnostics, and brought back online. The contacts persisted. An airborne early warning aircraft, an E-2C Hawkeye, also picked up contacts. The tracks held up against more than one sensor, which is part of why the crew could not simply write them off as clutter. There is an important honesty to maintain even here, at the strongest part of the case. Radar is not magic. It can be fooled by atmospheric ducting, by temperature inversions that bend signals, by spurious returns. Some skeptical analysts have proposed that at least part of the 2-week tracking record could reflect such effects. The counterpoint, from those who take the case seriously, is that atmospheric artifacts do not usually correlate with a simultaneous visual sighting by 4 trained aircrew and an infrared lock by a separate jet. The strength of the Nimitz case is not any single sensor. It is the convergence of several, of different kinds, on the same day. But the existence of the skeptical argument is part of the honest record, and we include it. On November 14th, for the first time, a visual intercept was attempted. The Princeton vectored Fravor and Dietrich toward the contact's reported position. As they descended toward the coordinates, both crews noticed a disturbance on the ocean surface, a roughly circular patch of churning whitewater, by Fravor's description about the size of a Boeing 787, as if something just below the surface were agitating the water. And then, above that disturbance, they saw it, a white, smooth, oblong object. Fravor estimated it at roughly 40 feet long, about the size of his own aircraft. No wings, no tail, no visible propulsion, no exhaust plume, no rotor wash, no markings. It moved erratically above the whitewater, with what Dietrich described as no predictable trajectory. It is worth slowing down on what makes this particular sighting hold up better than most. There were 4 trained aircrew involved, 2 pilots and 2 weapons systems officers, across 2 aircraft, observing in clear daylight, at relatively close range, for a span of minutes rather than a fleeting instant. These were not casual observers. They were carrier aviators whose profession is the rapid, accurate identification of aircraft, trained specifically to recognize and classify objects in the air under pressure. Fravor was the squadron commander and a Top Gun graduate. When observers of that caliber, in those conditions, with that much time, come away unable to match what they saw to any aircraft in the inventory, the report carries a weight that a single startled glimpse from the ground does not. None of this makes their interpretation infallible. Trained observers can still be fooled, and human perception has known failure modes even among experts. But it places the sighting near the top of the quality scale for eyewitness testimony. And it is part of why this case, more than thousands of others, broke through into congressional hearings and front pages. Fravor began descending toward it in a spiral, trying to get closer. By his account, the object then began to mirror his movements, which led him to describe it, in later interviews, as appearing aware that the aircraft was there. It is worth being precise here. Appearing aware is Fravor's honest description of how the motion looked to him. It is a trained observer's impression, not a measured fact about the object's intentions. We will be careful throughout this video to keep that line clear between what was observed and what the observation might mean. As Fravor tried to cut across toward the object, it accelerated rapidly and was gone, fast enough that, to him, it seemed to simply disappear. Seconds to a minute later, the Princeton reacquired a contact on radar, by the published accounts, roughly 60 miles away. Some accounts note that this was near the strike group's Combat Air Patrol rendezvous point. Whether that was coincidence or something more is exactly the kind of detail that has been dramatized in retellings. The documented fact is the requisition at distance, and the speed it would imply is far beyond any conventional aircraft. We will resist the temptation to embellish it into the object, reading secret communications, because the record does not establish that. It establishes a fast requisition at a distance that is hard to explain conventionally. This is a good moment to be explicit about a method we will use throughout, because the Nimitz case is where the temptation to overreach is strongest. There is a real, documented event here. An object reacquired far away, very fast. There is also a dramatic interpretation layered on top in many retellings. that the object somehow knew the fleet's pre-briefed coordinates, which existed only in closed military systems, and therefore was waiting for them, implying it could read encrypted communications. This second claim is far stronger than the first, and the public record does not support it. It is entirely possible the requisition near the CAP point was coincidental. It is possible the object was simply moving through the same general airspace the exercise used. It is possible the detail has been sharpened in the retelling. The disciplined approach is to report the documented fact, fast requisition at distance, and to flag the dramatic interpretation as interpretation, not fact. Every time this story is told with the "it was waiting for them" framing presented as established, a real and puzzling event has been quietly upgraded into something the evidence does not support. We will keep the puzzle and drop the upgrade. A short time later, a second flight cruise targeting camera locked briefly onto an object before it moved off again. That aircraft's infrared targeting pod captured roughly 90 seconds of footage, the clip later known as FLIR 1. The weapons systems officer who recorded it, Chad Underwood, is the one who coined the nickname that stuck, the Tic Tac. That, in careful terms, is the Nimitz encounter. Multiple trained observers, multiple independent sensors, ship's radar, an airborne radar, and an infrared targeting pod. Clear daylight, and an object whose described behavior did not match any aircraft the aircrew knew. The phrase, "a multiple independent sensors," is doing important work here, and it is worth being precise about why it matters so much in this field. The single greatest weakness of UFO evidence, historically, has been its reliance on a lone human witness, and human perception, however sincere, is a notoriously unreliable instrument. People misjudge distance, size, and speed badly, especially against a featureless sky with no reference points. They pattern match unfamiliar things into familiar shapes. Memory reshapes the event with each retelling. A single eyewitness account, no matter how honest, is weak evidence. What strengthens the Nimitz case enormously is that the human observations did not stand alone. They were accompanied by radar tracks from a sophisticated ship-based system, by contacts on a separate airborne radar, and by an infrared recording from a targeting pod. Three classes of instrument that operate on entirely different physical principles and fail in entirely different ways. For all of them to be fooled simultaneously, in the same direction, by the same illusion, is far harder to arrange than for one tired pilot to misjudge a distant balloon. That convergence is the difference between a campfire story and a genuine anomaly. And it is precisely why this case, out of thousands, is the one that broke through. The aircrew were met with some ribbing from shipmates, and then, by the accounts of those involved, there was no formal follow-up investigation that they were ever made aware of. No briefing. No official interview. Fravor returned to his duties. The footage and the incident reports went into files. There is something quietly telling in that response, or rather that non-response. A carrier strike group had just logged, across 2 weeks and multiple sensors, an object its own most advanced systems could not identify, culminating in a close-range daylight encounter by its squadron commander. And the institutional reaction was, essentially, nothing. No urgent threat assessment, no sustained investigation that reached the witnesses. Whatever one concludes about the objects, that institutional shrug is itself a finding. It tells you that in 2004 the system had no place to put a report like this, no protocol, no office, no incentive structure that treated unidentified object outperforming our aircraft as something to be chased down rather than quietly filed. The phenomenon, whatever it was, fell into an institutional blind spot so complete that the natural response to an extraordinary encounter was to look away. That blind spot, more than any single sighting, is what the years after 2017 would slowly begin to address. The phenomenon, though, because the Nimitz encounter was not isolated, and not unique within the community of military aviators who had been quietly filing similar reports for years, continued until December 2017, when the New York Times published a front-page investigation revealing that the Department of Defense had funded a program to study exactly these kinds of reports, and that the question of what the objects were remained, in the careful language of government documentation, unresolved. What military pilots had been seeing for years, reporting through channels that often led nowhere, and quietly being stigmatized for, had now become an official, acknowledged, open question of American national security. For the first time, the government had said, in public, that there was a category of objects in its airspace it could not identify. This video is about what that acknowledgement actually amounts to, and, just as importantly, what it does not. Here is the genuine puzzle at the center of the story. The United States operates one of the most sophisticated air defense and surveillance infrastructures ever built. Its radar networks, satellites, and sensor platforms can detect and track objects at remarkable ranges. And that infrastructure has, on a documented set of occasions, logged contacts it could not identify. Objects that did not match anything in the known inventory of any nation, captured across more than one type of sensor, by trained crews, over a span of years. That is not a claim about belief. It is a claim about what sensors recorded and what official documents say. And it is worth separating, very carefully, from the much larger and much noisier world of UFO claims, most of which do not survive scrutiny. The majority of UAP reports, on investigation, turn out to have ordinary explanations. Balloons, drones, aircraft, satellites, optical effects. The interesting part of the story is the small residue that does not. It is hard to overstate how important that separation is to thinking clearly about this subject. The word UFO carries 70 years of cultural baggage, abductions, crop circles, grainy hoaxes, late-night radio, an entire entertainment industry. That baggage is exactly why serious people avoided the topic for decades, and it is exactly why the government eventually adopted the drier term, UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, in an attempt to study the signal without the noise. The signal, properly defined, is narrow. Instances where well-positioned sensors and trained observers recorded objects whose behavior could not be conventionally explained, documented well enough to analyze. The noise is everything else, and the noise is vast, sincere, and mostly mistaken. A great deal of confusion about this subject comes from failing to hold that line. People point at the noise to dismiss the signal, or point at the signal to validate the noise. Neither move is sound. Throughout this video, when we say the phenomenon is a real, we mean only the narrow thing. That a small, well-documented residue resists conventional explanation. We do not mean the vast cultural edifice of UFO lore, almost none of which meets that standard. By the end of this video, you will understand what the declassified UAP reports actually contain, not the headline version, but the documented version. You will understand the specific flight characteristics that recur in the highest quality military encounters, and what they would and would not imply. You will understand why the most careful analysts are also the most cautious. And you will understand why the official position today is, precisely, that the phenomenon is real, that a subset of cases is unresolved, and that no evidence of extraterrestrial origin has been established. Three statements that are all true at once, and that the loudest coverage in both directions tends to flatten. This is not a video about believers versus skeptics. That framing has dominated this subject for 70 years, and it is precisely the framing that has prevented serious engagement with what the data actually shows. We stay in the documents. We follow the sensor data, the congressional testimony, and the official reports, and we do not reach past what the record supports, in either direction. The believers versus skeptics framing fails for a specific reason. It forces every fact into one of two predetermined camps, when the facts themselves do not sort that way. A radar track is not a believer fact or a skeptic fact. It is a measurement, and it means what careful analysis says it means, no more and no less. The moment you join a camp, you start reading every new piece of evidence as ammunition for your side, rather than as information about reality. The believer counts every unexplained case as proof of the extraordinary. The skeptic explains away even the genuinely puzzling ones, and both stop actually looking. The only useful stance is the one that has no camp. Take each case on its own merits, follow it as far as the evidence goes, stop where the evidence stops, and be willing to say, explained, unexplained, or not enough data to tell, as honestly about one case as the next. That stance satisfies no tribe. It is also the only one that can actually learn anything. What the record supports is already remarkable enough. Before we go deeper, if this kind of document-driven storytelling is what you're looking for, subscribe to Galaxy Pulse. Every video is built on primary sources, not speculation, and we are as careful about what we don't claim as about what we do. We go beyond the headlines every single time. Now, back to the phenomenon. To understand why the 2017 revelation landed the way it did, we need to go back not to 2004 and not to 2017, but to the structure of how the U.S. government has handled this question, including a Pentagon-funded effort that became public in that 2017 story, and whose details have been contested ever since. The program most often named is the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ALTIP. According to the public record, it operated from roughly 2007 to 2012, and is generally associated with a figure of about $22 million in Pentagon funding. To put that in perspective, against an annual defense budget in the hundreds of billions, that figure is a rounding error. Institutionally, the program was tiny and low profile. The smallness of that budget is itself revealing and worth pausing on. $22 million, spread over several years, is not the budget of a major weapons program or a serious crash effort to reverse engineer revolutionary technology. It is closer to the budget of a modest research study. This cuts against the most dramatic versions of the story in one direction, and supports a more measured reading in another. If the government truly possessed recovered exotic craft and was racing to understand them, a program funded at this level would be wildly inadequate to the task, which is part of why skeptics doubt the grandest claims. But the existence of any dedicated, classified funding at all, after decades of official insistence that the government did not study the subject, is itself significant. The honest reading is that the funding level describes a serious but small research effort. Enough to take the question seriously, not nearly enough to suggest a vast hidden enterprise. Both the believers, they're hiding everything, and the dismissers, there was never anything to it, struggle against that middle-sized fact. Here, it is important to be honest about something the popular retellings often blur. There were, in fact, related but distinct efforts, and the 2017 New York Times story conflated some of them. The $22 million funding is most directly tied to a contract associated with Bigelow Aerospace, a Nevada company founded by Robert Bigelow, who had a documented interest in the subject, under an effort to study advanced aerospace threats. The program was championed in the Senate, largely by then-Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada, working with Senators Daniel Inouye and Ted Stevens to secure the funding. A former Defense Department counterintelligence officer, Luis Elizondo, became publicly known in 2017 as the person who had led the Pentagon's UAP effort, and he has been the most prominent public face of the disclosure movement since. His involvement in UAP-related work inside the Department of Defense is documented. Harry Reid, for one, publicly vouched for it. But the precise nature and scope of his role has been contested. The Pentagon's press office, after initially appearing to confirm his role, later disputed that he had led the program as described. We flag this not to dismiss him, but because being straight about contested points is the whole job here. The honest summary is, a small, low-profile Pentagon effort to study these reports existed. It is real, and the exact org chart, budget attribution and leadership of it remain partly disputed in the public record. This kind of contested detail is, frankly, characteristic of the entire subject, and learning to sit with it is part of engaging with it honestly. The UAP field is unusually full of claims that are partly true, partly embellished, and partly impossible to verify from the outside. Because so much of the relevant material is classified, because memories degrade over decades, and because the topic attracts both sincere witnesses and people with incentives to overstate. A responsible account does not resolve every such dispute. It marks them clearly, separates the documented core from the contested margins, and resists the temptation to round a messy reality up into a clean narrative. The documented core here is solid. The U.S. government spent money studying these reports, took them seriously enough to fund the effort, and did not emerge with a conventional explanation that closed the question. The contested margins, who exactly led what, how the budget was allocated, what was found beyond the public record, are exactly that, contested. We will keep marking the line. What is less disputed is the kind of thing these efforts were set up to determine. Whether the phenomenon represented a foreign adversary capability, something Russia, China, or another state was operating in or near U.S. airspace, or something else. And the reason the question stayed open is that, across the highest quality cases, the data did not cleanly fit the adversary explanation, nor the known atmospheric phenomenon explanation, nor obvious misidentification. That pattern is the technical heart of the story. Here is what abnormal looks like on military sensors. Every aircraft that operates in or near U.S. military airspace obeys physics in ways that produce a predictable signature. Thrust-to-weight ratios, bound acceleration. Aerodynamic lift requires forward speed and control surfaces, wings, tails, rotors. Inertia limits how sharply a vehicle can change direction. Propulsion produces heat, which infrared sensors detect. High speed through the atmosphere produces friction heating, which is also detectable. Fighters accelerate hard, but cannot exceed structural and human G limits. Missiles are fast, but follow ballistic arcs. Helicopters hover, but are slow and loud. Each category has a recognizable profile. It is worth understanding why this baseline is so reliable, because it is the foundation on which the whole notion of an anomaly rests. Air defense is, at heart, a pattern recognition discipline. Over many decades, militaries have cataloged the signatures of essentially everything that flies: its speed range, its altitude band, its radar cross-section, its heat signature, its maneuver envelope. A trained radar operator does not just see a blip. They see a blip that behaves like a commercial airliner, or like a flock of birds, or like a weather balloon drifting on the wind, or like a fighter under power. The behavior is the identification. This is why the experienced operators aboard the Princeton in 2004 were unsettled. The contacts did not behave like anything in the catalog. It was not that the operators lacked imagination. It was that the behavior did not map onto any known entry in a catalog built from decades of watching the sky. An anomaly, in this world, is not a thing I haven't seen before. It is a thing that behaves in a way nothing in my experience behaves. That is a higher bar, and it is the bar the best cases clear. Now, here is what a subset of the highest quality UAP reports describe. And it is important to say that these are descriptions and estimates drawn from witness accounts and sensor data, not settled measurements with confirmed error bars. Objects appearing to accelerate extremely rapidly with no visible propulsion, no exhaust, no obvious thermal plume. Objects reported to change direction or hold position in ways that, taken at face value, would imply forces no piloted aircraft could survive. Objects reported at very high altitude and then at low altitude in implausibly short spans. Objects reported to hold a stationary hover in strong winds with no visible means of doing so. And, in some cases, objects reported to move between air and water. The gap between normal and these descriptions is the gap the investigation lives in. It is not a gap that misidentification easily closes when the same characteristics show up on radar, infrared, and visual observation at once. But, and this is the discipline the careful version of the story requires, the descriptions are exactly that, descriptions. Converting appeared to accelerate instantly into a confirmed acceleration figure requires sensor calibration data, range data, and error analysis that, in many of these cases, is either classified or simply was never captured cleanly, because the instruments were not designed for it. The honest position is that the highest quality cases are genuinely hard to explain, not that the most dramatic interpretation of them has been confirmed. Inside the Pentagon effort, a framework emerged for describing the recurring anomalous characteristics of the best cases. It came to be known informally as the 5 observables. They were not laid out in the 2017 disclosures. They emerged afterward through public statements and analysis. They are worth understanding, because they are the technical core of why this phenomenon is taken seriously by the people who study it most carefully. The first is anti-gravity lift, or sustained hover with no visible means of support. Objects reported holding position, sometimes in high winds, without rotor wash, exhaust, or any detectable propulsion. To appreciate why this is strange, consider that every method humans have for staying aloft involves pushing something down or moving fast enough for wings to generate lift. A helicopter pushes air down with its rotor. A jet moves fast enough that its wings work. A balloon is lighter than the air around it. An object that simply holds a fixed point in a strong wind, with nothing visibly pushing air and no wings doing work, does not fit any of these. Either it is using a method of support we cannot see, or one we do not understand. The second is sudden and extreme acceleration. Objects reported going from hover or slow drift to very high speed in spans that, if accurate, imply accelerations far beyond piloted aircraft. The key qualifier, again, is if accurate. But in the cases where multiple sensors and trained observers agree, the reported acceleration is the single hardest characteristic to reconcile with known engineering. The third is hypersonic velocity without signatures. Objects reported moving at very high speed without the sonic booms, thermal plume, or other signatures that physics predicts for an object of that size, moving that fast through air. When an aircraft goes supersonic, it produces a sonic boom. When it goes hypersonic, it heats up dramatically from air friction, glowing in the infrared. An object reported moving at such speeds, while remaining acoustically and thermally quiet, is producing a signature profile that is not merely faint but wrong, present on the sensors, but not behaving the way the physics of fast atmospheric flight says it should. The fourth is low observability, or the apparent ability to be present on one sensor and not another. Behavior not cleanly accounted for by known stealth technology, which reduces radar cross-section but does not selectively appear and disappear across sensor types. Stealth aircraft like the B-2 and F-35 are shaped and coded to scatter and absorb radar. They are not invisible, and they are certain, not invisible to infrared while visible to radar, or vice versa. Reports of objects that appear on one modality and vanish from another, in combinations no known stealth design produces, are part of what keeps the best cases in the unresolved column. The fifth is trans-medium travel, the reported ability to move between air and water, two media that differ in density by a factor of roughly 800. Without the deceleration or structural consequences a known vehicle would suffer. A vehicle hitting water at speed experiences something close to hitting a wall. This is why high divers are so careful, and why aircraft that ditch in the ocean are usually destroyed. An object reported transitioning between air and water at speed, intact, is doing something that no known vehicle, submarine, aircraft or missile, is built to do. Each of these, alone, might be chipped away at, attributed to a sensor artifact, an atmospheric effect, an observer error, a parallax illusion. The reason the framework is taken seriously is that, in the best cases, several appear together on multiple sensors, reported by trained crews. That combination is what resists easy explanation. It is also, however, exactly where caution is most required. Resists easy explanation is not the same as has been shown to violate physics. The 5 observables are a description of what the hardest cases look like, a map of the mystery, not a solution to it, and not a proof of any particular cause. Let us make the physics concrete, because it matters, and because it cuts both ways. Take one of the dramatic claims, an object going from a hover to a very high speed in about a second. If an object reached roughly Mach 5, around 100 kilometers per hour, from a standstill in 1 second, the average acceleration would be on the order of 170 times the force of gravity. For reference, trained pilots in G-suits can handle around 9 G briefly. The human body suffers serious injury well below 50 G. At 170 G, a human occupant would not survive, and most known structures would fail. So if such a figure were accurate, it would mean one of two things. Either the object carries no human occupant, it is autonomous or remotely operated, which is conceivable with current technology, since drones can tolerate forces that would kill a pilot. Or, the object is not subject to inertial forces the way known structures are, which would imply a propulsion or physics we do not currently understand. But notice the if. The honest difficulty is that we usually do not have clean, calibrated measurements of these accelerations. We have radar tracks, infrared clips, and trained observer estimates. Good evidence that something hard to explain happened, but not the kind of laboratory-grade data that would let us state an acceleration figure with confidence. A careful skeptic will point out that apparent instantaneous motion can sometimes be produced by sensor effects, by an object moving toward or away from a sensor, or by tracking jumps between two separate objects. A careful proponent will point out that in the best multi-sensor cases, those explanations have been considered and do not obviously fit. Both are being honest. The truthful statement is that the best cases are genuinely unexplained, and that, unexplained, is a smaller, more precise claim than a physically impossible by any known means, which is itself smaller than a therefore non-human. It is worth walking through why even the advanced drone explanation, which is the most conservative way to accommodate extreme performance, runs into trouble with the full set of observables. A drone can indeed tolerate higher G-forces than a piloted craft, because there is no fragile human inside. So extreme acceleration alone does not require exotic physics. But a drone still needs propulsion, and propulsion produces heat and exhaust. The reports of acceleration without any thermal signature are not explained by removing the pilot. A drone still has to obey the physics of fast atmospheric flight. The reports of hypersonic motion without a sonic boom or friction heating are not explained by removing the pilot. And no drone we know of transitions from air into water at speed and survives. So, it's just a very advanced drone, can absorb one or two of the observables, but strains badly against the others taken together. That is the pattern across this whole subject. Any single observable has a candidate mundane explanation, but the conjunction of several, in the same well-documented event, is what no current explanation comfortably covers. This does not prove the exotic. It precisely locates why the mundane explanations feel incomplete. Keeping those three statements distinct, unexplained, versus impossible by known means, versus non-human, is the entire discipline of this subject. Most public coverage collapses them. We will not. Here is where the story expands beyond airspace management, and where the national security framing becomes genuinely interesting. The argument made in congressional testimony by intelligence officials since around 2020 is not, "This is fascinating, so study it." It is sharper. If a foreign adversary possesses craft that can evade U.S. air defenses and outperform U.S. aircraft, then core assumptions of American security, air superiority, the integrity of the airspace around sensitive sites, are wrong. And that is a serious problem regardless of what the objects ultimately are. This reframing is, in a sense, what finally made the subject respectable inside the government. For decades, UFOs were a punchline, something no serious official wanted to be associated with. But unidentified objects are operating in restricted military airspace, and we cannot identify or counter them. Is not a punchline. It is a straightforward statement of an air defense gap, the kind of thing the national security apparatus is built to take seriously. By stripping away the cultural baggage and stating the problem in operational terms, officials created the institutional permission to study it that had been missing since Blue Book. Whether the objects turn out to be adversary drones, atmospheric oddities, or something stranger, the operational concern is the same and is legitimate on its own terms. A military that cannot account for what is flying through its training ranges has a real problem, independent of the metaphysics. But that framing runs into a difficulty its own proponents have acknowledged. If this were Russian or Chinese technology, why would similar reports stretch back decades, to eras when neither nation had anything close to the aerospace base such technology would require, and when the United States itself did not? An adversary that secretly developed a revolutionary capability, operated it in American airspace for decades, and never once used it offensively, revealed it diplomatically, or leveraged it in any Cold War confrontation, is not a very parsimonious explanation, either. So, the national security analysis tends to back itself into a corner. The adversary explanation is strained by the history, and the alternatives are uncomfortable. That corner is part of why the congressional hearings since 2020 have had a careful, uneasy quality. Different from the confident dismissal of the previous 70 years. It is not that officials have concluded what the phenomenon is. It is that they have concluded the easy explanations do not cover all of it, and have been unwilling, in public, to say what they think occupies the remainder. The impression left by the 2017 story, that government interest began around 2007, is off by about 60 years. Systematic U.S. investigation began in 1947, the year pilot Kenneth Arnold's sighting near Mount Rainier gave the press the term flying saucer. Within weeks, the Army Air Forces opened Project Sign. It became Project Grudge, then Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 to 1969, and investigated 618 reported incidents. Of those, 71 were classified as unidentified at closure, meaning no conventional explanation could be assigned, which is not the same as meaning they were exotic. That distinction is worth dwelling on. because it recurs throughout the entire history of this subject and is constantly misused. Unidentified is a statement about the limits of an investigation, not a statement about the nature of the object. A case can end up in the unidentified pile simply because the witness report was vague, the sighting was brief, no instruments were involved, or the trail went cold before analysts could run it down. Most of Blue Book's unidentified cases are unidentified in this weak sense, not because the object defied physics, but because there was not enough information to close the file. The same is true today. When RO leaves a case unresolved, that usually means insufficient data and not confirmed anomaly. This is the single most common error in popular UFO coverage, treating "we couldn't identify it" as if it meant we identified it as something extraordinary. It does not. The genuinely interesting residue is much smaller than the raw, unidentified count, and consists of the cases that remain puzzling even when there is good data. Blue Book was closed following the Kundin report, a University of Colorado study that concluded UAP posed no national security threat and offered no scientific value worth pursuing. That report has been criticized since. Reviewers noted that its confident summary did not always match the more equivocal findings in its own body, where some individual cases were left genuinely unexplained. After Blue Book, the official line became that the government no longer investigated UAP. Reports from pilots still got filed. Officially, no one was systematically studying them. What is now documented, through Freedom of Information releases, testimony, and former official statements, is that interest never entirely stopped, and that the national security apparatus contains exactly the kind of compartmented program structures in which low-profile work can continue without public visibility. That is not, by itself, evidence of a cover-up of exotic material. It is evidence that the institutional machinery for quiet, restricted work exists, which matters for the next part of the story. The leap that careless coverage makes from "secret programs can exist" to "therefore secret programs are hiding alien craft" is exactly the leap the evidence does not license. The existence of a lockable filing cabinet is not evidence about what is in it. In 2023, a former intelligence officer named David Grush, who had worked on UAP matters for the National Reconnaissance Office and as that office's representative to the Pentagon's UAP body, filed a whistleblower complaint with the Intelligence Community Inspector General. He alleged that the government had been operating concealed programs involving the retrieval and analysis of craft of non-human origin, and that information had been improperly withheld from congressional oversight. Grush testified before Congress in July 2023, under oath. He stated that he had been told about these programs by individuals with direct knowledge, that he had referred specifics to the Inspector General, and that he had faced retaliation. The Inspector General reportedly found his complaint credible and urgent. Here precision matters enormously. Grush did not testify that he had personally seen recovered craft or bodies. He testified that he had been informed of such programs by others, whom he found credible, and that he had passed the specifics to oversight bodies. That is second-hand testimony given in good faith under oath, which is meaningful, but is a different evidentiary category from first-hand documentary proof. He provided no physical evidence in open session, citing classification, and said the classified material had gone to the appropriate committees. The distinction between first-hand and second-hand testimony is not a technicality. It is central to how seriously to weigh the claim. A witness who says, "I saw the craft," can, in principle, be tested. Where, when, under what conditions, with what corroboration. A witness who says, "Credible people told me the craft exists," is reporting something real, that such claims are circulating among people with access. But the chain of verification now runs through individuals who have not themselves testified, whose identities are classified, and whose own basis for the claim cannot be examined. This does not make Grush dishonest. By all accounts he is sincere, and the Inspector General's reported assessment of his complaint as credible and urgent is significant. But a sincere official sincerely relayed what credible colleagues told him is precisely as strong as the underlying sourcing, which the public cannot see. It is a reason to investigate. It is not, by itself, a reason to conclude. What the public record establishes is therefore narrow but real. A credentialed official, through a legitimate process, made these claims under oath, and the IC Inspector General reportedly treated his complaint as credible and urgent. It does not establish that the claims are true, and it sits alongside an equally important fact, which the more breathless coverage tends to omit. That fact is the government's own counter-finding. In 2024, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, RO, the Pentagon's current UAP body, released a historical record report reviewing U.S. government UAP activity going back to 1945. Its conclusion was blunt. It found no evidence that any U.S. program had recovered or reverse-engineered extraterrestrial technology. It assessed that many such claims traced back to misidentification, misunderstanding of genuine but ordinary classified programs, and circular sourcing. That last phrase, circular sourcing, describes a phenomenon worth understanding, because RO argued it accounts for a striking share of the recovered craft lore. The pattern works like this. A person hears a claim, repeats it to others, and years later hears the claim come back to them from a different direction, now seeming independently corroborated, when in fact it is the same original claim echoing through a closed community. In a world of classification, where people cannot freely compare notes and check sourcing, this kind of echo can make a single unverified story sound like multiple independent confirmations. RO review also found that some witnesses had sincerely misinterpreted real but conventional classified programs, advanced but entirely human aircraft, sensors, or weapons projects, as evidence of exotic technology, precisely because the secrecy around those programs invited dramatic interpretation. None of this proves there is nothing to find, but it offers a concrete, mundane mechanism by which a large body of sincere-sounding testimony could exist without any exotic craft behind it, and a responsible account has to weigh that mechanism seriously. Grush and some members of Congress challenged that report's methodology, arguing it relied too heavily on voluntary cooperation to detect programs that were, by hypothesis, being actively hidden. So, the dispute remains formally unresolved. A whistleblower's second-hand allegations on one side, the government's own review finding no supporting evidence on the other. And in its 2024 annual report, RO director stated plainly that the office had discovered no evidence of extraterrestrial beings, activity, or technology, while also acknowledging, and this is the part that should not be lost, that there are genuine anomalies the office cannot yet explain. That report documented hundreds of new cases received in a single year, the large majority of which were resolved or expected to resolve as ordinary objects, balloons, drones, aircraft, and increasingly, the bright trains of satellites from megaconstellations like Starlink, which have generated a wave of sincere but mistaken reports. Out of that large intake, only a small number, on the order of a couple dozen, contained enough quality data to warrant continued active investigation. RO leadership was careful to add that the rising number of reports reflected better reporting and reduced stigma, not necessarily more objects in the sky. Both halves of the official position are real. The responsible way to hold this story is to hold both at once: no confirmed evidence of anything extraterrestrial, and a residue of genuinely unexplained cases. Neither half cancels the other. If the encounters were randomly scattered across all airspace, the sensor artifact, and atmospheric quirk, explanations would be more comfortable. The pattern that researchers have noted in the documented military record is not entirely random. A recurring association with military assets, and in particular with nuclear-related facilities. The most cited example is Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. On March 16, 1967, a flight of Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles at Malmstrom's Oscar flight went off alert status, losing launch readiness, in a tightly clustered way that a subsequent investigation reportedly could not conventionally explain. Captain Robert Sullis, the launch officer on duty, has said a security guard reported a glowing object near the facility around the time of the shutdown. Sullis went public decades later, and, in 2010, joined other former Air Force officers at a National Press Club event, describing similar incidents at nuclear sites. It is worth understanding why a simultaneous missile shutdown would alarm anyone familiar with these systems. Minuteman missiles were engineered, deliberately and at great expense, with independence and redundancy, precisely so that a single fault could not take multiple missiles offline at once. The whole point of the design is that the deterrent cannot be casually disabled. So, a cluster of missiles dropping off alert together is, by design, supposed to be extremely improbable through ordinary malfunction. That is what makes the reported incidents noteworthy. Not merely that something went wrong, but that something went wrong in a way the system was specifically built to prevent. The Air Force did investigate such incidents at the time, and in some cases identified or proposed engineering causes. In others, the cause reportedly remained undetermined. The accounts that have reached the public are a mixture of documented fact and decades-old recollection, and some specifics have been disputed by other participants. These accounts are striking, and they come from credible former officers. They are also, in important respects, hard to fully verify decades after the fact, and some details have been disputed by other accounts of the same events. The honest framing is that there is a documented pattern of reported anomalies near nuclear and military assets, reported by serious people, and that the pattern is suggestive without being, on the public record, conclusively established as to cause. Declassified material from the former Soviet Union contains broadly comparable reports near its own nuclear facilities, which deepens the puzzle without resolving it. The fact that the pattern shows up on both sides of the Cold War is, depending on your framework, either a hint that something was genuinely interested in nuclear weapons, or a reflection of the simple fact that nuclear facilities were among the most heavily guarded, most closely watched, and most meticulously documented places on Earth. Meaning anomalies there were far more likely to be noticed and recorded than anomalies over empty ocean or open desert. Both readings are defensible. That is the nature of this evidence. The naval pattern is more recent and better instrumented. The 2004 Nimitz encounter was not isolated. The USS Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group logged a sustained series of encounters off the East Coast in 2014 and 2015, with multiple aviators, among them Ryan Graves, who would later testify to Congress, reporting objects they encountered regularly enough to treat as a flight safety concern. Those encounters drove the Navy, in 2019, to formally update its UAP reporting procedures, explicitly to reduce stigma and improve data collection, which was itself a quiet institutional admission that stigma had been suppressing reports. And, in 2019, vessels including the USS Omaha off California tracked objects on multiple sensors, with footage later released. One widely discussed clip appears to show an object entering the water. The Roosevelt encounters are, in some ways, more telling than the dramatic single-day Nimitz event, precisely because of how mundane they became to the pilots involved. Graves has described objects that his squadron encountered so routinely, over so many flights. that they stopped being a shocking anomaly and started being a recurring presence in the operating area, something to be aware of, like weather or other traffic. The objects reportedly appeared on the aircraft's upgraded radar and infrared systems day after day. This is a different kind of evidence from a single spectacular sighting. It is the evidence of repetition, of a phenomenon that showed up reliably enough to be studied, if anyone had been positioned to study it. It also reframes the famous Navy videos. The clips the Pentagon eventually acknowledged as authentic, not as freak one-off captures, but as samples from an ongoing series of encounters that the aircrew considered, in Graves's framing, a genuine safety issue in their airspace. Whether the objects were exotic or not, the routine presence of unidentified objects in active military training airspace is, on its own terms, a real operational problem. None of these has been assigned a confirmed conventional explanation. None has been confirmed as anything exotic either. They sit in the unresolved column. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released the first public assessment, a 9-page, preliminary assessment, unidentified aerial phenomena, produced by a task force within naval intelligence. It examined 144 reports, mostly from military aviation, from 2004 to 2021. It assigned a confident conventional explanation to exactly one. The other 143 were left unresolved. But the report was careful to say that this reflected limited data, not a conclusion that the objects were exotic. That one of 144 figure became a headline in itself, and it is worth reading correctly because it is a perfect example of how a real number can mislead. It sounds staggering. The U.S. intelligence community could explain less than 1% of its own UAP cases. But the report itself explained why. In most cases, there simply was not enough data to assign a confident explanation, and the task force chose not to guess. Unresolved here means we will not file this as explained without sufficient evidence, which is methodologically responsible. But it is the opposite of, we determined these were extraordinary. A more data-rich version of the same exercise, 3 years later, would resolve a far larger fraction, precisely because better reporting and better sensors closed more cases. The low resolution rate in 2021 was a measure of data scarcity, not of how many genuinely anomalous objects were in the sky. Reading it the other way is the single most common distortion of the official record. It laid out explanatory buckets: airborne clutter, atmospheric phenomena, U.S. developmental programs, foreign adversary systems, and other. It declined to assign probabilities, citing insufficient data. It noted that some objects showed unusual flight characteristics, while cautioning that these could reflect sensor errors or observer effects rather than truly exotic performance, a caveat frequently dropped from coverage. The successor office, RO, has since expanded the case inventory into the hundreds, and then beyond 1,000 as reporting increased. By its 2024 reporting, RO had received many hundreds of new reports, resolved a substantial fraction as balloons, birds, drones, and satellite constellations like Starlink, and flagged a small number, on the order of a couple dozen in that cycle, as containing enough data to keep actively investigating. Its directors have consistently paired two messages. The increase in reports reflects better reporting, not necessarily more objects. And while no extraterrestrial evidence has been found, some cases remain genuinely unexplained. The Starlink point deserves a moment, because it is a near-perfect illustration of how the noise in this subject is generated. SpaceX's Starlink and similar megaconstellations have placed thousands of satellites in low orbit, and shortly after launch they travel in tight, bright trains across the night sky, a row of lights moving in formation, utterly unlike anything most people have seen before. To an untrained observer, A Starlink train looks exactly like a fleet of unidentified craft flying in precise formation. And it has generated a wave of sincere, confident UAP reports from people who saw something genuinely strange and genuinely unidentified to them. They were not lying or foolish. They saw an unfamiliar thing and reported it honestly. It simply had a mundane explanation. Multiply that dynamic across drones, balloons, camera artifacts, aircraft seen at odd angles, and atmospheric optics, and you can see how the vast majority of reports resolve into the ordinary, and why the small residue that survives all these explanations is the only part worth real attention. The fact that RO can name the mundane sources of most reports is not a weakness in the data. It is what gives weight to the handful of cases it cannot dispose of. That is the official position, stated in the language of intelligence assessment rather than television. The phenomenon is real as a category of unidentified objects. A minority of well-documented cases is genuinely unexplained, and no evidence of extraterrestrial origin has been established. All three at once. There are three serious frameworks for the unexplained residue, and honest analysts disagree about their weight. The first is advanced technology of uncertain origin, possibly a foreign adversary, possibly a misjudged domestic program. Under this view, the dramatic observables reflect a mix of real but conventional advanced technology, plus sensor and observer limitations. Its strength is that it is actionable and demands no new physics. Its weakness is the historical depth of the reports and the difficulty of squaring the most extreme observables, trans-medium travel, signature-less hypersonic motion, with any known engineering, adversary, or domestic. There is a sharp internal tension in this framework that is worth naming. If the objects are an adversaries, then the United States faces a catastrophic intelligence and technology gap, and the rational response is alarm and massive investment. But the same historical depth that troubles the framework also argues against it. An adversary that had held such a decisive advantage for decades and never once converted it into strategic leverage would be behaving in a way no rational state behaves. And if the objects are a misjudged domestic program, some deeply classified American craft, then one has to explain why the U.S. military's own pilots and ships have been chasing, fearing, and reporting it as a potential threat, which would be an extraordinary and pointless deception of one's own forces. Neither subversion is comfortable, which is why even the most conservative framework does not sit easily. The second is an unrecognized natural phenomenon, some atmospheric, plasma, or geophysical effect not yet characterized, capable of producing structured, seeming returns on multiple sensors. Science has a real track record here. Ball lightning was dismissed as myth for centuries before being taken seriously, and there are genuinely strange, still debated atmospheric phenomena like the long-observed lights in the Hessdalen Valley in Norway. The weakness is that natural phenomena do not obviously explain the apparent responsiveness in some encounters, or the consistent trans-medium reports. A plasma does not dive into the ocean and keep going. Still, this framework has the virtue of reminding us that unexplained has, historically, far more often resolved into a previously unknown natural process than into anything more exotic. The third is technology of non-human origin. This is the framework public conversation reaches for first, and that official bodies have been most reluctant to state. Its support, such as it is, comes from the failure of the first two frameworks to cover the full residue, the consistency of the observables, and the whistleblower testimony. Its decisive weakness is evidentiary. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the public evidence, however genuinely puzzling, does not meet the standard required to assert non-human origin, and the government's own historical review found no supporting evidence for retrieval programs. It is also worth being honest that this framework, more than the others, is the one people want to be true, or want to debunk, for reasons that have nothing to do with the evidence. The pull of the question, "Are we alone?" is so strong that it distorts judgment in both directions. The discipline required is to notice that pull and set it aside, and to ask only what the data supports. The data, at present, supports unexplained. It does not support non-human, where the community actually stands. Every official body's formal position is that the phenomenon is unresolved and no extraterrestrial evidence has been established. The strain on the first two frameworks is real and acknowledged. But the easy explanations don't cover everything is not the same as, therefore the hard explanation is correct. The space where the easy explanations fail is exactly where careful people decline to plant a flag, and that restraint is a feature of good analysis, not a failure of nerve. There is a specific discomfort this subject produces in the people who study it most carefully, and it is worth naming. It is not the discomfort of not knowing. Scientists and analysts live with that. It is the discomfort of knowing enough to suspect that what you don't know might matter, while operating inside institutions whose incentives have long discouraged saying so. For decades, a military pilot who reported a UAP risked stigma and a medical review, got no information back, and saw no investigation result. The rational individual choice, stay quiet, worked directly against the institutional interest in understanding what was in the airspace. Ryan Graves made exactly this point in his July 2023 congressional testimony. He described objects encountered regularly during East Coast training, objects that stayed put in strong winds, that appeared on radar and infrared at once, and explained that pilots mostly did not report them because reporting was a career risk with no upside. The implication is important and sobering. The official case inventory is not the full encounter rate. It is the fraction that survived a filter of stigma and bureaucratic indifference. If the documented cases are the ones that made it through that filter and still could not be explained, then a fuller, stigma-free reporting record would most likely contain more unexplained cases, not fewer. This is a genuinely powerful piece of reasoning, and it is worth following carefully, because it is one of the few places where the structure of the evidence lets us say something rigorous about what we are not seeing. Imagine a filter that lets through only a fraction of encounters, the ones a pilot judged worth the career risk of reporting. That filter does not select randomly. It selects for the encounters that were most striking, most clearly anomalous, most impossible to ignore. The mundane stuff, the quick glimpse, the probable balloon, was the easiest to let pass unreported, because reporting it carried risk and offered nothing. So, the reported set is not a representative sample of all encounters. It is biased toward the strange, and yet even this set, pre-selected for strangeness, is the set that RO cannot fully explain. The logic suggests that systematic, no-stigma reporting would not dissolve the mystery. It would more likely surface additional hard cases currently going unrecorded. That is a real inference, and it stands entirely on its own, without requiring any exotic interpretation of what the objects are. It is simply a statement about how the data we have was generated, and what that implies about the data we don't. That is a genuine analytical point, and it stands on its own without any exotic interpretation. Better data collection is the precondition for ever resolving the question, in either direction. And it is the one corrective that nearly everyone in this story, skeptic and proponent alike, agrees on. What has changed since 2017 is not the phenomenon, and not really the underlying data. What has changed is institutional permission to look. The Navy updated its reporting procedures. Congress held public hearings. Former officials used whistleblower channels to put specific allegations on the record. And, importantly, the scientific community began, cautiously, to engage. In 2021, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics held a symposium on the topic. That same year, Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb, known for arguing that the interstellar object Oumuamua deserved consideration as possibly artificial, a view most of his colleagues do not share, founded the Galileo Project, an academic effort to study UAP with purpose-built sensor networks and standard scientific methods. Loeb's argument is procedural. The data describes objects with physical characteristics. Those characteristics can be analyzed with physics, and the stigma around the subject is not a scientific reason to avoid it. The Galileo Project's early results have been appropriately modest. Most initially unidentified objects, on analysis, turned out to be birds, balloons, aircraft, or instruments, with a small unresolved residue still under study. The significance is less in the early findings than in the existence of a rigorous, instrumented, peer-reviewable effort at all. The Galileo Project's approach is, in a sense, the antidote to everything that has made this subject so frustrating. For 70 years, the evidence base consisted largely of unrepeatable events. A pilot saw something, a radar caught something, and afterward there was only testimony and a grainy clip to argue over. Science struggles with unrepeatable events. Its power comes from controlled, repeatable, instrumented observation. What Loeb's project does is flip the model. Instead of waiting for dramatic encounters and then arguing about ambiguous records, it deploys calibrated cameras and sensors that watch the sky continuously, recording everything in a known format with known error characteristics, so that anything anomalous is captured with data clean enough to actually analyze. The early yield of genuine anomalies is small, which is exactly what an honest effort should report. But the method is sound, and it is the method that could, over years, either build a rigorous catalog of truly unexplained objects, or demonstrate that the residue shrinks to nothing under good instrumentation. Either outcome would be a real contribution. The point is that, for the first time, the question is being approached with the tools that could actually answer it. In 2023, a NASA-convened independent study team reached a complementary conclusion. Existing data is insufficient to determine the nature of UAP, but that insufficiency is a product of poor, unsystematic data collection rather than something inherent, and NASA recommended applying systematic, sensor-based methods going forward, and named a director of UAP research. The through line of all this serious engagement is the same: build better data before drawing conclusions. It is worth noticing how unanimous the rigorous voices are on this single point. The skeptics, the agnostics, and even the cautious proponents all agree that the existing data, however suggestive, is not good enough to settle the question, and that the path forward is systematic measurement rather than more argument about old footage. That consensus, quiet as it is, may be the most important development of all, because it points at something achievable. Let us be honest, finally, about the gap between the public reports and the classified record, because it is real but easily mythologized. The public ODNI and RO reports are deliberately constructed to inform oversight without disclosing classified sources, methods, or higher classification findings. Members of Congress who have been briefed on classified supplements have said, on the record, that the classified material contains more detail than the public versions, and some have expressed concern, independent of what the objects are, that programs may have been run outside proper oversight. Senator Marco Rubio, as a senior Intelligence Committee figure, framed his concern precisely that way. Not, aliens are confirmed, but, if programs exist outside the oversight framework, that is a constitutional problem regardless of what the phenomenon turns out to be. This is the part of the story that deserves more attention than it gets. Precisely because it is the part that does not depend on resolving the central mystery. Whether the objects are foreign drones, natural plasma, or something stranger, the question of whether the U.S. government has properly accounted for what it spends, studies, and stores, and whether the committees the Constitution charges with oversight have been given the access they are legally owed, is a concrete governance question with a concrete answer. It is the kind of question that congressional oversight exists to resolve through compelled testimony, subpoenas, and access to classified records. The push behind much of the recent legislative activity, including proposals to create formal review boards with authority to examine and declassify UAP records, is driven at least as much by this oversight concern as by curiosity about the objects themselves. A democracy is entitled to know that its secret programs are accountable to someone, even if the subjects of those programs remain genuinely unknown. That institutional concern about oversight, classification, and fragmented knowledge inside the government is arguably the most concrete and verifiable issue in the whole story. Different parts of the government appear to hold different pieces of the picture, and the formal process of assembling a complete one is ongoing and contested. That is a real finding. It is also a much narrower finding than the government is hiding alien craft, and it is important not to let the second swallow the first. The fragmentation is documented, the alien craft are not. Conflating the two, treating evidence of disorganized, overcompartmented record-keeping as evidence of a deliberate cover-up of extraterrestrial technology, is the move that turns a legitimate governance story into an unsupported sensational one. The legitimate story is interesting enough on its own. After everything, the Nimitz encounter, the 5 observables and their careful limits, the contested history of the Pentagon programs, the nuclear site reports, the official assessments resolving only a fraction of cases, the whistleblower testimony, and the government's own counter-finding. Here is the honest accounting. The phenomenon is real, in the specific sense that a well-documented subset of multi-sensor encounters describes objects that have not been identified and that resist easy conventional explanation. That is the finding of the government's own assessments. What the objects are remains unresolved. The adversary and natural phenomenon explanations are under genuine strain in the hardest cases. The non-human explanation is not supported by evidence meeting the standard such a claim would require, and the government's historical review found no evidence for the retrieval programs alleged by whistleblowers. And the most verifiable concern in the entire story is the narrowest sounding one. That the machinery of classification and oversight around this question has been fragmented and imperfect, such that even within the government, no single body may hold the whole picture. Those 3 statements are all true together. Holding them together, without collapsing into either "it's all nonsense" or "it's confirmed aliens," is what the evidence actually demands. It is worth sitting with how unusual that intellectual position is, because the pull toward one pole or the other is relentless. The culture offers 2 comfortable stories. One says, it is all misidentification, hoax, and wishful thinking, and serious people should not waste time on it. The other says, the truth is out there, the government has the bodies in a hangar, and only cowardice or conspiracy keeps it hidden. Both stories are easy to tell, emotionally satisfying, and shareable. The actual evidence supports neither. It supports a third position that is harder to hold precisely because it offers no resolution. There is a real, narrow, well-documented residue of genuinely unexplained encounters. There is no evidence that residue is extraterrestrial, and there is a real, separate governance problem about how secretly all of this has been handled. Living in that third position, refusing both the comfort of dismissal and the comfort of revelation, is uncomfortable. It is also, on the current evidence, the only honest place to stand. But there is one thread we have not fully followed, and it may be the most consequential. The pattern of encounters near nuclear weapons facilities, the missile shutdowns, the reported objects over silos and storage sites on both sides of the Cold War, is the part of this story that is simultaneously the most documented by credible former officers and the least conventionally explained. Whether it represents coincidence, observation, interference, or something we don't have a category for, and what the classified investigations of those specific incidents actually concluded, is a story that goes deeper than anything we covered today. It is also the part of the story where the two readings we have kept separate all video, the mundane and the extraordinary, come into the sharpest possible contact. The mundane reading is strong. Nuclear facilities were the most watched, most documented, most security-conscious places on the planet, so of course anomalies were noticed and recorded there more than anywhere else, and of course tightly engineered systems occasionally fail in ways that take time to diagnose. The extraordinary reading is hard to fully dismiss. The specific, repeated correlation between reported objects and weapons system malfunctions, reported independently by serious officers on both sides of the Cold War, is the kind of pattern that does not obviously fall out of the mundane explanation alone. We are not going to resolve it here, and we are not going to pretend it resolves cleanly in either direction. We are going to give it the full, careful treatment it deserves, the documents, the testimony, the disputes, and the limits of what can actually be known. That one is next time. Tonight, we did not follow speculation, we followed documents, and we were careful about where the documents stop. We followed the radar tracks and infrared footage of an object a decorated naval commander encountered off California in 2004, and could not explain. We followed the contested, partly disputed history of the small Pentagon programs that studied such reports. We followed the official assessments that resolved only a fraction of their cases, while flagging a genuine anomalous residue. We followed congressional testimony, both the whistleblower's second-hand allegations and the government's own finding of no supporting evidence. And we followed the physics of the dramatic claims, while being honest that unexplained is a smaller and more accurate word than impossible, which is smaller than non-human. If there is a single thread running through all of it, it is the discipline of the qualifier. At every turn, the careful version of this story depends on words that the sensational version drops. Reported, estimated, appears, consistent with, if accurate, secondhand, contested, unresolved. Those words are not hedging for its own sake. They are the precise markers of where solid ground ends and inference begins, and on a subject this prone to both wishful thinking and reflexive dismissal, keeping track of that boundary is the whole task. Strip the qualifiers out and you get the version that fills the internet, confident, thrilling, and unsupported. Keep them in, and you get something less satisfying but far more honest, a genuine mystery, precisely bounded, with the known parts clearly separated from the unknown. We sat with the specific discomfort this produces in serious people. Career officers, analysts, and scientists who encountered the data without a prior commitment to either tidy answer, and found themselves in the uncomfortable middle where the evidence actually lies. That middle ground offers no clean conclusion. It requires holding a rigorous evidence standard and an honest acknowledgement that the best cases are genuinely unexplained. At the same time, 3 questions the record does not answer. First, what is in the classified material beyond the public reports? Briefed members of Congress say there is more detail. The whistleblower says there is far more than that. The government's own review says it found no evidence of recovered craft. These cannot all be fully reconciled on the public record, and only proper oversight can resolve them. The good news is that this is, in principle, resolvable. Congress has the legal authority to compel testimony, review classified programs, and declassify records. The question is whether it will exercise that authority fully, and whether the answers it finds will ever be made public. Second, what is the true encounter rate? Because stigma suppressed reporting for decades, the official inventory is a floor, not a ceiling. Without systematic, stigma-free reporting, the statistical picture is incomplete. This too is resolvable, not by argument, but by changing the reporting culture so that the data starts reflecting reality. The Navy's procedural changes are a first step. Whether they are enough to overcome decades of ingrained stigma remains to be seen. Third, what will purpose-built scientific data collection show? The Galileo project, the NASA-recommended approach, and improved RO methods are early. The rigorous, sensor-grade dataset that could actually resolve the hardest cases does not yet exist in sufficient quantity. But it is being built, and within years rather than decades, it should begin to yield results clean enough to analyze without the ambiguity that has plagued every prior generation of evidence. That dataset, more than any leak or testimony, is what could finally move the question from unexplained toward an actual answer. These are not permanently unanswerable. They have answers that declassification, honest reporting, and rigorous data collection can produce. The direction of travel is toward more data and more scrutiny. The destination is not yet known, and the honest thing is to say so, and to keep building the means to find out. A few things worth taking from this, whatever the phenomenon turns out to be. The first is the cost of stigma. When the rational individual choice is to stay silent, the institution goes blind. For decades, the culture around reporting guaranteed that the official record would be thinner than reality. Fixing the incentive structure has to come before the data can improve, and that is a lesson far beyond this subject. Any field in which accurate reporting carries a personal cost, whether it is near misses in aviation, errors in medicine, or safety problems in engineering, will systematically underrecord exactly the events it most needs to study. The UAP case is an unusually pure example of the pattern, but the pattern is everywhere, and the fix is always the same. Make honest reporting safe before expecting honest data. The second is the cost of classification without oversight. Restricting information that doesn't fit existing frameworks is understandable, but it can create blind spots that persist for decades, with different parts of the same government holding different pieces of the picture. That is a governance problem, independent of what the objects are. Secrecy is a tool, and like any tool, it has costs as well as benefits. One of its least appreciated costs is that it can prevent an institution from ever assembling what it collectively knows, because no single person is cleared to see all the pieces. A question can remain unanswered, not because the answer is unavailable, but because the answer is scattered across compartments that cannot legally be combined. The third is the cost of institutional timidity in science. The long gap between Blue Book's closure and serious academic re-engagement was not caused by an absence of data. The reports existed. It was caused by the absence of permission to look. Permission, when it came largely from outside the scientific community, from government acknowledgments and congressional hearings that changed the social cost of engagement. That is not how scientific priorities should be set. Science is supposed to follow the data, not the social weather. The fact that a genuine empirical question could be left largely unstudied for 50 years because it was embarrassing is a sobering comment on how much the practice of science is shaped by reputation and incentive, not just evidence. The fourth is what official acknowledgement does and does not mean. We don't know what this is the formal establishment of a question, not the answer to it. Reading, "we don't know," as a "therefore it must be X," is the error that has distorted this subject from both directions for 70 years. Skeptics read official caution as confirmation that there is nothing there. believers read official uncertainty as a concealed admission that there is everything there. Both are reading a conclusion into a statement that, taken honestly, contains none. We don't know means we don't know, and the maturity to leave it there, while building the means to find out, is rarer and more valuable than either premature certainty. And the fifth is the danger of building frameworks on a sample of one. We built our sense of what can fly, and what technology looks like, on our own engineering history. We built our sense of what is physically possible on the physics we have so far discovered. The unexplained residue, whatever it is a standing reminder that those frameworks might be incomplete in ways we cannot fully appreciate from inside them. That is not an argument for credulity. It is an argument for humility. The appropriate response to a genuine anomaly is neither to force it into the existing categories, nor to leap past all categories into the most exciting one. It is to hold the anomaly open, gather better data, and let the answer, conventional or otherwise, emerge from evidence rather than from what we hoped or feared it would be. So, I'll leave you with a few questions. What does it mean that the most sophisticated air defense system ever built has logged contacts it cannot explain for decades, and that the institutional response, for most of that time, was to discourage the reporting rather than investigate the contacts? How do we tell the difference between healthy skepticism and institutional resistance that has more to do with professional incentives than with the quality of evidence? And how do we make sure we are not making the same error in reverse, mistaking a genuine mystery for a confirmed answer? And if briefed members of Congress are right that the classified record holds more than the public knows, what are the right mechanisms to make sure that information reaches the oversight bodies and the public that a democratic system says it should? There is one more question worth sitting with, and it is the one that outlasts whatever the objects turn out to be. For 70 years, a question with potentially enormous implications sat in front of the most capable institutions on Earth, and those institutions chose, again and again, the comfort of not looking, not because the evidence was absent, but because looking was embarrassing, career-threatening, and culturally radioactive. What else are we not looking at right now, for the same kinds of reasons? What other genuine anomalies are sitting in files, unstudied, because the social cost of taking them seriously is higher than the personal reward? The UAP story, whatever its resolution, is a case study in how an entire civilization can decide, collectively and without ever quite admitting it, to look away from something it finds uncomfortable. That tendency does not only apply to objects in the sky, it is worth asking where else it operates. Sit with those. They are not rhetorical. If this stayed with you, tell me in the comments which part landed hardest: the Nimitz radar tracks, the contested history of the programs, the whistleblower testimony set against the government's own counter-finding, or the quieter, more verifiable concern about oversight and classification underneath all of it. And if you want more stories told this way, built on primary sources, careful about the line between what's documented and what's inferred, and unwilling to reach past the evidence in either direction, subscribe to Galaxy Pulse. That is the only honest way to tell a story that matters this much. I'll see you in the next one. For decades, the official answer was that there was nothing to see. The pilots kept seeing something. The radar kept tracking something. The records kept accumulating. Today, the official answer is different and more honest. There is a real category of objects we have not identified, a stubborn residue we cannot yet explain, and, so far, no evidence that any of it is extraterrestrial. The objects remain unidentified. What the long silence revealed about the institutions we built to understand our own skies, their blind spots, their incentives, their capacity for organized not looking, may, in the end, be the most important finding of all. Because the sky has not changed. The objects, whatever they are, were there in 1947, and they were there in 2004, and the radar is still catching some of them now. What has changed is us, slowly, reluctantly, against decades of institutional habit. We have begun to allow ourselves to look, not to believe, and not to dismiss, but to look. To build the sensors, to lower the stigma, to ask the oversight questions, to apply the physics honestly. That shift, from organized not looking to careful looking, is the real story of the past few years. The answer, when it comes, will come from that looking, and it will be whatever the evidence says it is, not whatever we hoped or feared. That is the only kind of answer worth having. Galaxy Pulse. Beyond the headlines, every single time,